What happens when a small group of distant colonies challenges the most powerful empire on Earth? In the late 18th century, the British Empire controlled vast territories across the globe and commanded the strongest navy in the world. Few people imagined that 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast of North America could threaten such power. Yet within just a decade, protests, boycotts, and political arguments turned into open rebellion, launching a war that would change global history forever. The origins of the American Revolutionary War can be traced back to 1763, when the 7 Years' War finally came to an end. This conflict had been fought across Europe, North America, Africa, and Asia. In North America, it was known as the French and Indian War, where Britain and France competed for control of territory. Britain emerged victorious. France lost most of its claims in North America, and British influence expanded dramatically. But victory came with a serious cost. The war had left Britain with an enormous national debt. British leaders now faced a difficult question: how would they pay for defending and governing these newly expanded territories? Their answer seemed obvious. The American colonies would help pay the bill. But this decision would ignite a political conflict that neither side fully expected. A sudden change in colonial policy. For many years before the war, Britain had largely allowed the American colonies to govern their own internal affairs. This unofficial approach is often called salutary neglect. Colonial governments managed local politics, trade was relatively flexible, and British oversight was limited. After 1763, however, Britain began tightening its control. One of the first major decisions was the Proclamation of 1763, issued by King George III. The proclamation prohibited colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. British officials hoped this would prevent new conflicts with Native American tribes and reduce the cost of defending frontier regions. But many colonists had fought in the recent war expecting access to Western land. Instead, the new law blocked their expansion. For many Americans, it felt like Britain was restricting their future, and this was only the beginning. In 1764, the British Parliament introduced the Sugar Act, which placed taxes on imported goods such as molasses. The law also strengthened enforcement against smuggling, meaning customs officials began inspecting ships more aggressively. Colonial merchants felt the economic pressure almost immediately, yet the deeper issue was not simply the cost of the tax. The real question was political. Did Parliament have the authority to tax the colonies at all? That question exploded into controversy the following year. In 1765, Britain passed the Stamp Act, requiring printed materials such as newspapers, legal documents, licenses, and pamphlets to carry official government stamps purchased from British authorities. This was the first direct internal tax placed on the colonies. The reaction was immediate and intense. Colonists argued that they had no representatives in Parliament, and therefore Parliament had no right to tax them. Their protests soon became a powerful political slogan heard across the colonies. No taxation without representation. Crowds organized demonstrations in colonial cities. Merchants coordinated boycotts of British goods, and groups such as the Sons of Liberty began actively resisting the law. The protests shocked officials in London. Facing economic pressure from British merchants whose trade had collapsed, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. For a moment, colonists believed they had won, but the British government had no intention of giving up its authority. On the same day the Stamp Act was repealed, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act. This law declared that Britain retained the authority to make laws binding the colonies, in all cases whatsoever. The message was unmistakable. Britain still intended to rule. Only a year later, new taxes appeared again. The Townshend Acts. In 1767, Chancellor of the Exchequer Charles Townshend introduced new import duties on goods such as glass, paint, paper, lead, and tea. These laws became known as the Townshend Acts. British leaders believed colonists might accept these taxes because they targeted trade rather than internal transactions, but they had misjudged colonial sentiment. Resistance quickly returned. Merchants organized new boycotts of British goods, and communities began promoting locally produced alternatives. Women played an important role by producing homespun clothing instead of buying British textiles. The movement against British policy was spreading. But nowhere were tensions higher than in Boston. Boston had become one of the centers of colonial protest. British authorities responded by sending troops to the city in 1768 to enforce order. Instead of calming the situation, the presence of soldiers created constant friction between civilians and the military. Arguments broke out in taverns and marketplaces. Suspicion grew on both sides. Then, in March 1770, tensions reached a breaking point. On the evening of March 5th, a crowd of colonists gathered near a group of British soldiers. The confrontation escalated quickly. Insults were shouted, and objects were thrown. Suddenly, the soldiers fired. 5 colonists were killed. Patriot leaders immediately used the event as propaganda. An engraving created by Revere portrayed British troops firing into a defenseless crowd, and the image spread across the colonies. The incident became known as the Boston Massacre. Public anger toward Britain intensified dramatically. Yet even after this tragedy, many colonists still hoped the crisis could be resolved peacefully. For a few years, tensions eased. But the conflict was far from finished. In 1773, Britain attempted to rescue the financially struggling British East India Company by passing the Tea Act. The law allowed the company to sell tea directly in the American colonies, bypassing colonial merchants. Ironically, this actually made legal tea cheaper, but many colonists saw the act as a political trap. If they bought the tea, they would be accepting Parliament's right to tax them. Resistance spread quickly again. In several colonial ports, tea ships were forced to return to Britain without unloading their cargo. But the situation in Boston would become far more dramatic. 3 British ships carrying tea were anchored in Boston Harbor in December 1773. The colonial governor refused to allow the ships to leave without unloading the cargo. On the night of December 16th, a group of colonists boarded the ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor. The protest became famous as the Boston Tea Party. For Britain, this was not simply a protest. It was open defiance. In response, Parliament passed a series of harsh laws in 1774 designed to punish Massachusetts. These measures closed Boston Harbor, restricted the colony's self-government, and expanded the requirement for colonists to house British soldiers. Colonists called these laws the Intolerable Acts. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, the laws united the colonies in anger. Later that year, representatives from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia at the First Continental Congress. The colonies were beginning to act together, and the possibility of war was becoming real. By early 1775, colonial militias in Massachusetts were preparing for conflict. When British authorities learned that weapons were being stored in Concord, troops were sent to seize the supplies. Patriot riders, including Revere, spread warnings through the countryside. On April 19, 1775, British troops reached the town of Lexington. A shot rang out. To this day, historians still debate who fired first. But within moments, gunfire erupted and 8 colonists were killed. The American Revolutionary War had begun. The colonies faced enormous challenges. Britain had a powerful professional army and the strongest navy in the world. Yet the colonies had determination. The Second Continental Congress created the Continental Army and appointed George Washington as commander. Despite early struggles, the army gradually improved. A turning point came in 1777 when American forces defeated a British army at the Battle of Saratoga. This victory convinced France to support the American cause. French money, troops, and naval power transformed the war. After several more years of fighting, the decisive moment arrived in 1781. British General Charles Cornwallis moved his army to Yorktown, Virginia. American and French forces surrounded the city while the French Navy blocked British ships from escaping. Cornwallis was trapped. He surrendered. The victory at Yorktown effectively ended the war. 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris in 1783 officially recognized the United States of America as an independent nation. The American Revolution began with debates about taxes and representation, but it ended by reshaping global history. 13 colonies challenged one of the most powerful empires on Earth and created a new nation built on ideas of liberty and self-government. Their struggle would inspire future revolutions and political movements around the world. If you enjoy exploring the real events that shaped our past, be sure to like and subscribe for more historical documentaries.